Sometimes everything is taken away by life, leaving you with nothing but your two hands and the guts to start over. As she stood outside Miller's general store, looking at an advertisement for a ranch hand that might be her final opportunity at Independence, Clara May was aware of that emotion. The work was at Eli Thatcher's Thornage Ranch. She was warned about him by everyone in town. They claimed that he was unworkable and cruel. 2 years prior, Clara had witnessed the loss of her savings when she buried her husband. She desperately needed a job. Fair pay for honest labor was promised in the advertisement. The fact that 12 ranch hands had quit in 18 months was not mentioned. Eli was too demanding. They all agreed. Clara, however, wasn't searching for simple labor. She was trying to find a spot to start again. What happens when a man who has given up on finding a committed partner meets a woman who has nothing left to lose? Tell us where you're tuning in from before we resume. Additionally, if this tale resonates with you, please make sure to subscribe, as I have something very special in store for you tomorrow. The morning sun, which had been waking Clara May for the last 18 months, since she had been forced to sell the farm, cast long shadows over her little rented room above Henderson's bakery. The plain gold band, which Thomas had saved 3 months' pay for, was her wedding ring, which she was moving between her fingers as she sat on the side of her tiny bed. By 32 years ago, the metal had grown thin with wear, but she couldn't bring herself to remove it. Not yet. The smell of fresh bread drifted up through the floorboards, reminding her that Mrs. Henderson would expect the rent by Friday. Clara opened the small wooden box on her nightstand and counted the bills inside. $12.37. Not nearly enough. She dressed carefully in her best dress navy blue, with small white flowers, mended at the elbows but still respectable. Thomas used to say it brought out the cornflower blue of her eyes. He'd been gone to winters now, taken by the consumption that had slowly drained their savings along with his strength. First the doctor bills, then the medicine that didn't work, then the funeral costs that seemed cruel in their precision. Clara walked to the small mirror above her wash basin and pinned back her graying brown hair. At 53, she still carried herself straight and strong, her hands steady from years of farm work. Those hands had delivered calves, mended fences, and held her husband through his final nights. They were good hands, capable hands, if the bank didn't see their worth. The memory of yesterday's conversation with Mr. Peterson still stung. She'd sat in his oak-paneled office, hat in her lap, explaining her situation with what dignity she could muster. "Mrs. May," he'd said, not unkindly, "you're 2 months behind on the room rent, and Mrs. Henderson has been more than patient. You need steady income, not the occasional sewing work you've been picking up." She'd known he was right. The seamstress work came sporadically, and her eyes weren't what they used to be for the fine detail work that paid better. Her back ached from hunching over other people's mending by lamplight, trying to make a few coins stretch to cover food and rent. "There's the county home," Peterson had suggested gently. "It's not charity, exactly, more of a community arrangement." Clara had visited the county home once, delivering quilts with the church ladies. The smell of boiled cabbage and despair had followed her home. The women there had the same hollow look she'd seen in her own mirror lately, the look of people who'd simply given up. "I'll find something," she told Peterson, standing with more confidence than she felt. "Just give me another week." Now, as she prepared for another day of searching for work that seemed not to exist, Clara reminded herself of what Thomas used to say during their hardest times on the farm. "The Lord provides." Clara May, maybe not what we expect, but what we need. She walked down the narrow stairs to the street, nodding to Mrs. Henderson, who was arranging fresh loaves in the window. The older woman's smile was kind but worried. Everyone in town knew Clara's situation, though most were too polite to discuss it openly. The morning air held the crisp promise of autumn, and Clara pulled her thin shawl tighter as she made her way down Main Street. Millerville was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, for better and worse. She passed the dress shop where she'd occasionally done alterations, but Mrs. Carmichael had made it clear there wasn't enough work to go around. At the post office, she inquired about mail sorting, but young Billy Martinez already handled that job, and his mother cleaned the building. The hotel had no need for another cleaning woman, and the school board had filled their limited positions. Months ago, Clara found herself walking toward the outskirts of town, past the small houses where other widows lived with their grown children, or relied on family support she didn't have. Thomas had been an only child, and her own family had scattered to other states long ago. The isolation of grief had been harder to bear than the poverty. though both pressed down on her with equal weight. She paused at the small cemetery, where Thomas rested beneath a simple headstone she'd paid for with the last of their savings. "Don't know what to do," she whispered to the weathered granite. "I'm not ready to give up, but I'm running out of fight." The wind rustled through the dry grass, and Clara straightened her shoulders. Thomas had fallen in love with her stubborn streak, had called it her finest quality, and when it frustrated him, she wouldn't disappoint his memory by surrendering without exploring every possibility. Walking back toward town, she noticed a small crowd gathered outside Miller's General Store. The bulletin board there served as the town's unofficial job exchange, though it usually held notices for farm help during harvest season, or requests for seasonal work that had long since passed. "Don't know why anyone would want that job," she heard Mrs. Collins saying to her neighbor. 12 men have come and gone from that place. Thatcher runs them off faster than he hires them." Clara moved closer, her curiosity overcoming her usual reluctance to join the town gossips. The women were studying a notice pinned to the board with a sturdy brass tack. "Ranch hand wanted," Mrs. Collins read aloud. "Honest work for honest pay. References required. Apply in person at Thornridge Ranch." "Eli Thatcher's place," whispered Mrs. Morrison, shaking her head. "That man's got a heart colder than January wind. Came back from the war different, they say. Mean as a rattlesnake, and twice as quick to strike. My nephew worked there last spring," added Mrs. Collins. "Thatcher barely spoke words to him the whole time, then let him go without explanation after 3 weeks. Just handed him his pay and told him to be off the property by sunset." Clara studied the notice more carefully. The handwriting was precise, controlled, the writing of an educated man. The paper was good quality, not the cheap stuff most people used for job postings, and the phrase "honest work for honest pay" struck her as different from the usual vague promises. Who would be fool enough to work for him? Mrs. Morrison was saying. Living way out there, miles from town, with a man who probably hasn't smiled since before the war. Clara thought about her dwindling money, about the county home, about the look of pity in Mr. Peterson's eyes. She thought about Thomas and his belief that the Lord provided what was needed, if it came in unexpected packages. "Excuse me," she said quietly, stepping forward. The women turned, surprised by her interruption. "Clara May," Mrs. Collins said with forced brightness. "How are you getting on, dear?" "I'm managing," Clara replied, though they all knew that wasn't entirely true. "The ranch, how far is it from town?" Mrs. Morrison frowned. "Oh, honey, you're not thinking of it. It's no place for a woman, especially alone. Thatcher's got no use for company, and the work would be too hard." "I'm stronger than I look," Clara said, studying the notice again. "And I'm not afraid of hard work." Mrs. Collins exchanged a meaningful glance with her companion. "Dear, you don't understand. Eli Thatcher isn't just difficult, he's dangerous. There are stories about what happened during the war, about why he came back so changed. A woman alone, out there, ... Clara felt a familiar spark of defiance, the same feeling that had helped her survive Thomas's illness. The farm foreclosure, and 18 months of uncertainty. Maybe Eli Thatcher was everything they said he was. Maybe he was cruel and impossible and would send her away within a week. But maybe, just maybe, he was simply a man who'd been hurt badly enough to build walls around himself. She'd known men like that. Thomas had been quiet and guarded when they'd first met, scarred by a childhood that had taught him not to trust easily. It had taken time and patience. But underneath his careful reserve, she'd found a man capable of deep love and loyalty. "How far?" she asked again. Mrs. Morrison sighed. "About 8 miles northwest. Follow the main road, past the Hendricks farm, then take the fork toward the mountains. You can't miss the entrance, big stone pillars, with Thornridge carved in them." Clara carefully unpinned the notice from the board, folding it, and placing it in her purse. The women watched with expressions of concern and disapproval. "Clara, may please reconsider," Mrs. Collins said. "There has to be another way." "Maybe there is," Clara replied. "But this is the way that's presenting itself today." She walked home with more purpose than she'd felt in months, the notice tucked safely in her purse like a promise. Back in her small room, she packed a few belongings into Thomas's old carpet bag, her good dresses, her Bible, the small sewing kit that might come in handy, and the photograph of her and Thomas on their wedding day. She held the photograph for a long moment, studying Thomas's gentle smile and her own young, hopeful face. "I know you'd want me to be careful," she said to the image, "but you'd also want me to be brave." That evening, Clara wrote a careful letter to Mrs. Henderson, explaining that she would be seeking employment outside of town and would settle her account as soon as possible. She folded the letter with $2 she could spare and slipped it under the landlady's door. Then she sat by her small window, looking out at the town where she'd lived for less than 2 years, but which had become her whole world. Tomorrow, she would walk 8 miles to meet a man everyone said was impossible to please. She would ask for a job she wasn't sure she could handle, working for wages that might or might not be fair. But tonight, for the first time in months, Clara May felt something that had been missing from her life. It was fragile and uncertain, like the first green shoots after a harsh winter. But it was real. She turned her wedding ring once more between her fingers, then carefully removed it and placed it in the small wooden box with her remaining money. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but she would meet it with her hands free and her heart open to possibility. The walk to Thornridge Ranch took Clara 3 hours, her carpetbag growing heavier with each mile. She'd started before dawn, wanting to arrive at a respectable hour, but needing time to cover the distance on foot. The main road was well maintained, and the morning air held that crisp clarity that made the mountains seem close enough to touch. As she passed the Hendricks farm, she could see Mrs. Ricks hanging laundry, and the woman paused to wave. Clara wondered if the gesture was friendly or farewell, perhaps both. By evening, word would spread through town that Clara had actually gone through with her foolish plan. The fork in the road came sooner than expected, marked by a weathered wooden sign pointing toward Thorn Ridge. Private property. Clara paused to adjust her grip on the carpetbag and smooth her dress. First impressions mattered, and she needed this job more than she needed her pride. The private road wound upward through scrub brush and scattered pines, the landscape growing more rugged with each turn. When the stone pillars finally came into view, Clara stopped and stared. Mrs. Morrison had mentioned them, but she hadn't captured their impressive size or the careful craftsmanship of the carved letters. These weren't the rough markers of a struggling ranch. They spoke of prosperity and permanence. Beyond the entrance, the road continued for another quarter-mile before opening onto a vista that took Clara's breath away. Thornridge Ranch, spread across a natural valley, with a main house positioned to overlook rolling pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. The house itself was larger than she'd expected, 2 stories of solid stone and timber construction, with a wide wraparound porch that suggested comfort rather than mere functionality. The outbuildings were equally well maintained, a large barn with fresh paint, several smaller structures that probably housed equipment and supplies, and a corral that showed recent repair work. This was not the harsh, unwelcoming place she'd been led to expect. Clara approached the main house, noting the neat flower beds that someone had tended with care, though they showed signs of recent neglect. A few late-blooming roses clung to a trellis beside the front steps, their petals scattered by recent wind. Before she could raise her hand to knock, the front door opened. The man who emerged was tall and lean, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples and eyes, the color of storm clouds. He wore clean work clothes and boots that had seen honest use, and when he looked at her, Clara felt the weight of careful assessment. This was Eli Thatcherand. He was nothing like the monster the town women had described. Serious, certainly. Guarded, definitely, but not cruel, at least not in any way that showed in his face. "You're here about the job," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." Clara May Hutchinson. She shifted the carpetbag to her left hand and extended her right. "I saw your notice in town." He studied her outstretched hand for a moment before taking it briefly. His grip was firm, but not crushing, the handshake of a man who judged character by how people carried themselves. "You walked from town?" "Yes, sir." "That's 8 miles." "Yes, sir, it is." Something that might have been approval flickered in his eyes. "Come inside. We'll talk." The interior of the house was as impressive as the exterior, with solid furniture and careful attention to detail. But Clara noticed immediately what was missing: the small touches that made a house a home. No flowers in vases, no photographs on the mantel, no cushions on the chairs. Everything was clean and functional, but it felt more like a well-maintained hotel than someone's residence. Ellie led her to a study lined with books, where a large desk dominated the room. On the desk, Clara glimpsed a framed photograph turned face down, and nearby, what looked like military papers. He gestured to a chair across from his desk, and she sat carefully, placing her carpetbag beside her feet. "Experience?" he asked, settling into his own chair. "I helped my husband run our farm for 30 years. We raised cattle, grew our own food, maintained buildings and equipment. After he passed, I worked briefly for the Morrison family cooking, cleaning, general household management. Why did you leave the Morrison position? Clara hesitated. The truth was that Mrs. Morrison had needed to reduce expenses and could no longer afford hired help, but admitting that felt like confessing failure. The arrangement was temporary, she said finally. Mrs. Morrison's circumstances changed. Eli nodded, apparently accepting the diplomatic answer. The work here is demanding. I expect things done properly the first time. I don't have patience for excuses or complaints. I don't make excuses for poor work, Clara replied. And I don't complain about honest labor. The last 3 people I hired lasted less than a month each. The job requires someone who can handle isolation and independence. The nearest neighbor is 4 miles away, and I don't encourage socializing during work hours, Clara thought. About her lonely room above the bakery, about the long hours of silence that had become her constant companion. I'm accustomed to my own company. Room and board are provided, plus $30 a month. Meals are simple. I'm not looking for fancy cooking. The house needs cleaning and maintenance, and during busy seasons, you might be expected to help with ranch work. $30 a month was more than she dared hope for, enough to save a little after sending money to settle her debts, but she sensed that showing too much eagerness would be a mistake. What happened to your previous housekeeper? She decided ranch life wasn't for her. His tone suggested the conversation had been brief and final. May I ask why you're willing to hire someone without checking references? For the first time, Eli's expression shifted slightly, revealing something that might have been amusement. You walked 8 miles on the possibility of work. You're still sitting here asking sensible questions, instead of jumping at the first offer. That tells me more than a letter from Mrs. Morrison would. Clara realized he'd seen through her careful phrasing about her previous position, but apparently wasn't holding it against her. I should tell you, she said. People in town warned me about working here. They said you were difficult. And yet here you are. I need the work, and I've found that people's warnings usually say more about them than about the person they're warning against. This time, she was certain she saw approval in his eyes. The arrangement would be day-to-day at first. If it works out for both of us, we can discuss something more permanent. That seems fair. Eli stood, and Clara followed suit. I'll show you the room and explain the basic expectations. You can start tomorrow, if you're agreeable. He led her through the house, pointing out the kitchen, dining room, and sitting areas that would need regular attention. The room he showed her was on the ground floor, simply furnished but comfortable, with its own small window overlooking the front pasture. Meals are at 6 o'clock, noon, and 6 o'clock again, he said. I'm usually up before dawn and tend to work until dark. I'll eat whatever you prepare, but I'm not particular about fancy presentations. As they completed the tour, Clara noticed details that contradicted the stories she'd heard. The books in his study were well-read volumes on agriculture, history, and literature, not the collection of a cruel or ignorant man. The tools in the kitchen were high quality and well-maintained. Everything about the house suggested someone who took pride in his surroundings, even if he didn't actively enjoy them. Do you have questions? Eli asked as they returned to the front hall. Just one. Why did you come back to ranching after the war? The question seemed to surprise him, and for a moment, his careful composure slipped. Clara saw something raw and unguarded in his face before he regained control. This land has been in my family for 3 generations, he said finally. It was what I came back to. The way he said came back suggested the journey had been longer and more difficult than simple geography. Clara nodded, understanding that some stories required time and trust before they could be shared. I'll be here tomorrow morning, Mr. Thatcher. Eli, he corrected. If you're going to live here, we might as well skip the formalities. Clara, she replied on this time. His handshake lasted a moment longer as she walked back down the long drive toward town. Clara felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. Whatever Eli Thatcher's reputation might be, the man she'd met was complex rather than cruel, guarded rather than mean-spirited. The work would be demanding, but the house felt solid and peaceful, in a way that her small room above the bakery never had. For the first time in 2 years, Clara May was looking forward to tomorrow. Mountains. She'd packed Thomas's old work gloves in her carpet bag, cracked leather that had molded to his hands over years of use. Wearing them felt like carrying a piece of his strength with her into this new chapter. Eli was already in the kitchen when she knocked, dressed for the day's work, with his hair still damp from washing. He looked surprised to see her so early, then nodded approvingly. Coffee's made, he said, gesturing toward the stove. Help yourself. Clara poured coffee into a plain ceramic mug, noting the way Eli moved around the kitchen with efficient familiarity. This was a man accustomed to taking care of himself, she realized, which probably made accepting help more difficult than it should be. I thought I'd start with the kitchen and work my way through the house, she said. Get a sense of what needs regular attention. That's fine. Eli reached for his hat from a peg by the door. I'll be checking fence lines in the north pasture. Most of the morning. Jake Martinez will be here around 8th. My only full-time hand right now. Good man. Been with me 3 years. After Eli left, Clara stood alone in the quiet kitchen, sipping her coffee and planning her approach. The house was clean but lacked the deep attention that came from someone who truly cared about it as a home. Surfaces were wiped but not polished. Floors swept but not scrubbed. Windows functional but not sparkling. She started with the kitchen, working methodically through cabinets and drawers. Everything was organized with military precision, but she noticed gaps where dishes or utensils had broken and never been replaced. The pantry was well stocked with basics, but lacked the variety that made cooking a pleasure rather than mere sustenance. By the time Jake Martinez arrived, Clara had the kitchen gleaming and had started a list of small improvements that would make the space more functional. Jake was a weathered man in his 40s, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. You must be Clara, he said, removing his hat politely. Jake Martinez. Heard Eli finally found someone willing to take on this place. It's a beautiful ranch, Clara said, pouring him coffee without being asked. I can see why someone would want to stay. Jake accepted the coffee gratefully. Eli's a good man to work for, if you don't mind the quiet. He's fair with wages and won't ask you to do anything he wouldn't do himself. But he's been alone out here too long. I think place needs a woman's touch. How long has he been back? From the war? About 4 years now. Came back different, like a lot of them did. Keeps to himself mostly, but he takes good care of the land and the animals. That tells you something about a man's character. Jake's easy acceptance of her presence eased something in Clara's chest that she hadn't realized was tight with worry. If Eli's longtime employee approved of her being there, perhaps the arrangement might work after all. The morning passed quickly as Clara explored the house room by room. The sitting room needed attention. Dust covers on furniture that looked like it hadn't been used in months. Curtains that blocked more light than they let in. The dining room was similar, formal and unused, as if Eli had simply closed off the parts of the house that reminded him too much of family or entertaining. When she found the previous housekeeper's quarters, Clara understood why the woman had left. The room was cramped and cheerless, positioned at the back of the house with a single small window facing the barn. Clara's own room, by contrast, had been chosen to offer comfort and dignity, another sign that Eli Thatcher wasn't the unfeeling man people believed him to be. She was polishing the dining room table when Eli returned for lunch, bringing with him the smell of outdoors and honest work. Clara had prepared a simple meal, fried eggs, fresh biscuits, and preserves she'd found in the pantry. You didn't need to go to trouble, Eli said, but he ate with obvious appreciation. No trouble. I enjoy cooking for people who eat it. Clara refilled his coffee cup. Jake seems like good help. He is. His family has a small place about 10 miles south. He rides over most days, unless weather's bad. How large is the ranch? About 2,000 acres. Not huge by some standards, but enough to make a living if you manage it right. Eli's voice carried quiet pride. My grandfather started with a quarter section and built it up over time. Sensed this was more personal information than Eli usually shared, so she simply nodded and continued eating. Through the dining room window, she could see the rolling pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, and beyond that, the mountains that made a dramatic backdrop to everything. The house is well built, she said. Good bones, as my husband used to say. Your husband was in construction, farming, but he had a gift for seeing how things should be put together. Always said you could tell the character of a man by how he maintained his property. Eli glanced around the dining room, as if seeing it through Thomas's eyes, and Clara wondered what judgment he thought her deceased husband would render. After lunch, Eli returned to his work, and Clara continued her methodical exploration. In the study, she found the turned-down photograph she'd glimpsed earlier. She didn't touch it, but she could see it showed a group of men in military uniforms, all young and serious-faced. One of them was clearly Eli, though younger and somehow softer around the edges. The books on his shelves told their own story. Military history mixed with agricultural texts. Philosophy alongside practical manuals on cattle ranching. This was an educated man who had chosen to work with his hands, someone who thought deeply about both theoretical and practical matters. By evening, Clara had cleaned the main living areas and prepared a hearty supper of beef stew with vegetables from the ranch's own garden. She'd also made a mental list of small improvements that would brighten the house without overwhelming Eli's obvious preference for simplicity. During supper, their conversation was cautious but increasingly comfortable. Eli asked about her experience with different types of cooking, and Clara inquired about the ranch's seasonal rhythms. Neither pressed for personal details, but Clara sensed they were both taking each other's measure. The work today was satisfactory, Eli said as Clara cleared the dishes. Coming from him, she realized this was probably high praise. The house has good possibilities, Clara replied. With regular attention, it could be quite comfortable. Don't make unnecessary changes, Eli said, but his tone was mild rather than warning. I wouldn't presume to alter anything without discussing it first. That evening, Clara sat in her comfortable room, writing a brief letter to Mrs. Henderson to let her know she was safely settled. Through her window, she could see the lights in the main house and the gentle movement of cattle in the moonlit pastures. For the first time in months, Clara felt useful again. The work was satisfying in a way that mending other people's clothes had never been. This house, this land, had potential for restoration that went beyond mere maintenance. And Eli Thatcher, despite his reputation, was proving to be a man worth working for, and possibly worth understanding. By the end of her first week, Clara had established a rhythm that seemed to suit both her and Eli. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, spent mornings on household tasks, and used afternoons for deeper cleaning projects, or helping with ranch work when needed. Evenings brought simple suppers and cautious conversation. It was while cleaning Eli studied that Clara discovered the hand-carved chess set tucked away in a cabinet behind ledger books. The pieces were beautifully crafted, each one showing the patient work of someone who understood both the game and the art of woodworking. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface of a carved knight, admiring the detail in its flowing mane. My grandfather made that, Eli said from the doorway, startling her. He believed chess taught a man to think several moves ahead. Clara carefully placed the knight back on the board. It's beautiful work. Do you play? Used to, been a while, since I had an opponent. I learned from my father, Clara said, though I'm probably rusty. Something shifted in Eli's expression, not quite a smile, but a softening around his eyes. Maybe we could try a game sometime. That evening, after supper, Eli retrieved the chess set and placed it on the kitchen table. Their first game was tentative, both of them testing not just chess strategy, but the boundaries of their working relationship. Clara found that Eli played with the same careful precision he brought to ranch management. Thoughtful, methodical, always considering consequences. Your grandfather taught you well, Clara said, as Eli captured her bishop with an elegant combination she hadn't seen coming. He said chess was like ranching. You have to think about the weather 3 seasons ahead and always have a backup plan. Their games became a regular evening ritual, played over coffee while the day's work settled around them. Clara began to understand that Eli was not just intelligent, but genuinely thoughtful, someone who considered problems from multiple angles before acting. She also noticed that he seemed more relaxed during their games, as if the mental exercise provided a respite from whatever thoughts occupied him during the day. The first real test of their arrangement came when Clara announced her intention to visit town for supplies. I need some things for the kitchen, she explained, over breakfast, and I'd like to send a letter to settle some business back in town. Eli nodded, but said nothing, returning to his coffee with studied indifference. Clara sensed this was a moment that mattered, though she wasn't entirely sure why. The walk to town took the usual 3 hours, but the return journey felt longer. Under the weight of disapproving stares and whispered conversations, Clara had forgotten how quickly news traveled in a small town, and Clary's word of her employment at Thornridge had spread to everyone. At Peterson's bank, she deposited most of her first week's wages and arranged to send money to Mrs. Henderson. Peterson's eyebrows rose when he saw the amount, but he processed the transaction without comment. How are you finding ranch life? He asked with careful neutrality. It suits me well enough, Clara replied, matching his tone. At Miller's general store, the reception was less subtle. Mrs. Collins and Mrs. Morrison happened to be examining fabric when Clara entered, and their conversation stopped abruptly. Clara May, Mrs. Collins said with forced brightness. How good to see you. We've been wondering how you're managing out there. I'm managing very well, thank you, It must be terribly isolated, Mrs. Morrison added. All alone with that man, so far from town. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. Mr. Thatcher is a perfect gentleman, and the work is honest and fair. Still, Mrs. Collins persisted, people do talk. A woman alone in that situation, well, it doesn't look proper. Then perhaps people should find more constructive uses for their time than speculating about situations they don't understand. Completed her purchases with brisk efficiency, aware of the whispered conversations that followed her through the store. By the time she left, she was angry, not just at the gossips, but at their assumption that she couldn't take care of herself, or make sensible decisions about her own life. The walk back to the ranch gave her time to cool down, but also to think, was she being naive about her situation? Eli had been nothing but respectful, but she was indeed a woman alone, with a man she barely knew. Miles from help, if she needed it. When she arrived at Thornridge, Eli was in the kitchen, clearly waiting for her return. He took one look at her face, and correctly identified the source of her distress. Town gossips giving you trouble. Nothing I can't handle. Clara began unpacking her purchases with more force than necessary. People have small minds and smaller lives. They warned you about me, I suppose. Clara paused in her unpacking. They did. They said you were cruel and impossible to work for. And what do you think now? Clara considered the question seriously. I think you're a man who's been hurt and learned to protect himself by keeping people at a distance. I think the work here is honest and the wages fair. And I think people often confuse reserve with cruelty because it makes them feel better about their own nosiness. Eli was quiet for a long moment. The talk will get worse before it gets better. Are you prepared for that? I've lived through worse than gossip, Clara said firmly. Have you changed your mind about the arrangement? No. His answer came quickly, definitively. You're the best help I've had since I came back from the war. I just wanted you to understand what you're choosing. That evening, their chess game carried a different weight. They were no longer just employer and employee finding their way around each other. They were two people who had made a conscious choice to ignore outside pressure and judge their situation by their own standards. Your move, Eli said, studying the board where Clara had just placed him in an unexpectedly complex position. Sometimes, Clara said, watching him work through the implications of her play. The best move is the one nobody expects you to make. Eli looked up from the board, meeting her eyes directly. I'm beginning to understand that. As Clara prepared for bed that night, she reflected on how much had changed in just 1 week. She'd found work that challenged her, a living situation that offered both independence and security. And perhaps most surprisingly, the beginning of a friendship based on mutual respect, rather than convenience or desperation. The town could whisper all it wanted. She was exactly where she belonged. 3 weeks into her employment at Thornridge, Clara made a discovery that changed her understanding of both the ranch and its owner. While cleaning the main sitting room, a space Ely had told her was rarely used, she found a pressed wildflower tucked between the pages of a volume of poetry on the bookshelf. The flower was perfectly preserved, a delicate mountain bloom that must have been picked during the brief summer season, when the high meadows burst into color. Someone had chosen this particular flower, pressed it carefully, and placed it in a book that clearly meant something to them. The poem it marked was about remembering beauty in dark times. Clara studied the flower for a long moment, understanding instinctively that this small artifact held significance beyond its simple beauty. This was evidence of a gentler side to Eli Thatcher, proof that beneath his careful reserve lived someone who noticed and treasured delicate things. She returned the flower to its place and continued her work, but the discovery stayed with her. Over the following days, she began to notice other small signs of the man Eli might have been before the war. A sketch pad, hidden in a desk drawer. Garden tools maintained with loving care. Windows positioned to catch the best views of the mountains. The ranch house began to reveal its secrets, as Clara worked to restore its neglected comfort. She opened curtains that had been drawn closed for months, letting sunlight flood rooms that had lived in perpetual twilight. She polished furniture until it gleamed, arranged books more invitingly, and gradually coaxed the house back toward the home it had once been. Eli noticed the changes, but said nothing directly. Instead, Clara caught him pausing in doorways, looking around rooms as if seeing them fresh. Once, she found him standing in the sitting room in the early morning light, simply observing the way sunlight fell across the now clean surfaces. It looks different, he said when he realized she was watching. Better or worse? Better, he admitted. I'd forgotten how much light these rooms could hold. Clarara's efforts to improve the ranch extended beyond the house. She noticed that the flower beds around the main building had been expertly planned, but were now overgrown with weeds. During afternoon breaks, she began the patient work of restoration, pulling invasive plants and nurturing the perennials that had survived neglect. You don't need to do that, Eli said one afternoon, finding her on her knees among the roses. I know, Clarara replied, not stopping her work. But gardens are like people. They do better with attention and care. The comment seemed to catch Eli off guard, and Clarara wondered if she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. But when she looked up, she found him studying the garden beds with something like recognition. My mother planted these roses, he said quietly. She always said a house without flowers was just a building. This was the first time Eli had mentioned family, and Clara sensed the importance of the moment. She had good taste. These varieties will bloom until the first hard frost if they're properly tended. She would have liked that, Eli said. And Clarara heard layers of meaning in the simple statement. The real test of their developing partnership came during a crisis with the cattle. Clarara was hanging laundry when she heard shouting from the direction of the north pasture. Through the morning air, she could make out Jake's voice calling for help. Urgency clear in his tone. Without hesitation, Clarara dropped the wet sheets and ran toward the sound. She found Jake and Eli working frantically around a cow that had gone down during calving, the situation clearly complicated and dangerous. Breech birth, Eli called when he saw her approaching. We need to turn the calf, but she's exhausted and fighting us. Clarara had assisted with difficult births on her own farm, and she quickly assessed the situation. I have smaller hands, she said, rolling up her sleeves. Let me try. For the next hour, Clarara worked alongside the two men, her experience and calm presence helping to guide the difficult delivery. When the calf finally arrived alive and healthy, despite the complications, all three of them were covered in mud and exhaustion. That was good work, Jake said, grinning despite his fatigue. Haven't seen hands that steady since my grandmother was helping with births. Eli said nothing, but Clarara caught him looking at her with something like respect mixed with surprise. She realized this was the first time he'd seen her handle genuine ranch work, and she'd proven herself capable in ways that went beyond housekeeping. Your coffee is probably cold by now, she said, suddenly aware of how she must look. Coffee can wait, Eli replied. Good help is harder to replace than hot coffee. That evening, their chess game carried a different energy. Clara noticed that Eli seemed more relaxed, more willing to engage in conversation between moves. Where did you learn veterinary work? He asked as she considered her next play. My husband Thomas had a gift with animals. Said they trusted him because he never rushed them. I learned by watching and helping. He sounds like a good man. He was. Clarara moved her queen into position. He would have liked this place. He always said land had its own personality, and you had to listen to what it was telling you. What is this land telling you? Clarara looked up from the board, meeting Eli's steady gaze. That it's been well loved but lonely. That it has the bones of something beautiful, but needs someone who cares enough to tend it properly, and the people on it. The question surprised Clarara with its directness. She considered her answer carefully. I think the same could be said about the people. Something shifted in Eli's expression. A wall coming down, or perhaps a door opening slightly. You might be right about that. Later that night, Clarara lay in her comfortable bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch, settling into darkness. The cattle were quiet in their pastures, the horses content in their stalls. And somewhere in the main house, Eli was probably reading or working on ranch accounts by lamplight. For the first time since Thomas's death, Clarara felt truly useful, not just employed, but needed in ways that went beyond her ability to cook and clean. The ranch was responding to her care, and perhaps more importantly, so was its owner. She thought about the pressed wildflower, about Eli's mother's roses, about the way he'd looked at her after the difficult birth. Healing, she realized, was like gardening, required patience, attention, and faith that growth was possible, even in the hardest soil. The autumn storms arrived earlier than expected, bringing with them a test that would define Clara's place. At Thorn Ridge Ranch, she discovered her most treasured possession, her family Bible, while unpacking the last of her belongings. A leather-bound volume that had belonged to her grandmother, and guided for generations through times of joy and sorrow. The book fell open naturally to passages marked with pressed flowers and handwritten notes in the margins. A testament to the faith that had sustained her family through hardships. Clara traced the familiar words of comfort, remembering her grandmother's voice reading these same verses during the difficult years of Clara's childhood. When the first storm hit on a Tuesday evening, Clara was prepared for wind and rain. She wasn't prepared for the intensity of nature's assault on the ranch, or for the way it would strip away the last pretenses between her and Eli. The winds started at nightfall, roaring down from the mountains with such intensity that the sturdy ranch house moaned and creaked. Rain was moving horizontally across the valley by nightfall, and Clara could hear falling objects hitting the windows with frightening vigor. As she was tying up stray objects, Eli came into the kitchen, his face stern with worry, and his rain slicker dripping. He added, "Looks like it's going to be a bad one," as he examined the kitchen window's lock. "I need to check on the livestock, but Jake made it home before it got too rough," Clara said, reaching for her coat. "I'll accompany you." "Not necessary. You should stay inside where it's safe." Clara stared at him steadily. "I'm not made of sugar, and two people can do more than one. The rain won't melt me." Eli briefly appeared as if dispute, before giving a quick nod. "Keep close and follow my instructions carefully." The trip to the barn was perilous, with rain that stung like needles and wind that could have knocked someone down. Following Eli's example, Clara was appreciative of the rope line he had stretched between the house and the outbuildings for this very reason. The sound coming from within the barn was Clara could hear the cattle in the next shelter, moving restlessly, though it was a little subdued. The horses were pacing and whinnying in their stables because they were anxious. "Just need to make sure everyone's secure," Eli said, above the storm. "Wind can occasionally harm fencing or gates." They went through the barn methodically, making sure feed and water were available and inspecting latches. The animals appeared to relax in Clara's presence, and she found herself instinctively looking for indications of pain or discomfort. The real trouble surfaced when they relocated to the cattle shelter. A portion of the roof had fallen off, posing a risk of metal sheets escaping and hurting the animals gathered below. Eli mentioned, "We need to secure that before it tears completely loose." While researching the issue using expert evaluation, Clara glanced at the ladder that led to the roof, then at Eli's face in the lamplight. "How? Someone needs to get up there and tie it down temporarily until we can fix it properly tomorrow. It would be easier for someone smaller to move around up there without getting hurt." "Not at all. I'm light enough to avoid adding to the burden on already broken buildings, and I don't have heights." They shouted over the roaring wind during their brief but heated disagreement. Protective instinct ultimately lost out to practical necessity. As Eli fed her rope and tools, Clara cautiously climbed onto the roof. Together, they were securing the loose metal from the storm's attack. The work was demanding and risky, requiring collaboration and trust that went much beyond their typical working relationship. Something fundamental had shifted between them. By the time they returned to the home, both soaked and shaken, with hands that trembled a little from cold and adrenaline, Clara said simply, "Coffee," and they sat at the stove. The storm raged outside, but inside the warm kitchen, a different kind of intensity settled between them. "That was good thinking about the roof," Eli said at last, "and good work." They were sitting at the kitchen table, still in their wet clothes, drinking coffee that tasted like the best thing either of them had ever consumed. "I couldn't have done it by myself," Clara said. "We make a good team," before realizing how the words would sound. Eli, however, appeared unconcerned by the suggestion. "We do," he said softly. They alternated throughout the night, keeping an eye on the storm's development and checking on the animals. They discussed the difficulties of ranch life and the joy of well-done work more openly than they had ever done during the peaceful times. About how teamwork may do what individual effort was unable to. During one of their chats in the kitchen, Eli said, "I never expected to find a partner in this work. I felt that solitary labor was more my style after the war." Considering her marriage to Thomas, Clara remarked that sometimes the best partnerships form organically. You don't go out trying to find them. They just develop out of mutual respect and a shared goal. "Was it like that with your husband?" Startled by how effortlessly she could now discuss Thomas, Clara nodded. "First, we were buddies, pursuing similar objectives. Over time, the rest evolved. He was fortunate to discover you. We were fortunate to have met one another." Clara made a gentle correction. "Strong alliances are uncommon, sufficient to warrant not being taken for granted." Near daybreak, the storm eventually started to lessen, and by the time Jake got to work, the danger had gone. However, the aftermath showed how much damage had been done, with fencing down, debris all over the pastures, and repair work that would take weeks to finish properly. Looks like you two had quite a night, Jake said, observing their worn-out faces and the proof of labor done in trying circumstances. Eli said simply that Clara prevented the barn roof from collapsing. They would not have been able to function without her. Jake's face changed to one of understanding and respect. Clara understood that the storm knot had established something important. Not only her skill, but also her dedication to Eli's plan for the property. Clara experienced the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had demonstrated her abilities in ways beyond her initial job description as they discussed the day's repair work over breakfast. More importantly, though, she learned something about the man she was employed by. Eli Thatcher was a man worth fighting storms with. Despite his cautious reserve and self-protectiveness, on a clear October morning, a somber-faced clerk handed over the bank foreclosure notice. After making 2 apologies, he gave Clara the official mail addressed to Eli Thatcher. She took it in stride, as she always did in ranch business, but there was something about the young she felt a knot in her stomach at the man's manner. Clara did not violate Eli's privacy by placing the envelope on his desk without opening it. However, she could see by the look on his face that the news was just as dreadful as she had feared. When he came back from the south pasture that afternoon, he was standing still in his study with the opened letter in his hands when she softly inquired, "Problems?" I gave her a look she had never seen him make before. Not just anxiety, but failure. "The bank is phoning to collect the mortgage." Clara felt the breath leave her lungs. "You have 60 days to pay the entire amount owed, or forfeit the ranch." "What is their desired amount?" $8,000. Like a stone dropped into still water, the number fell between them. Even if I sold all the cattle on the land, I wouldn't be able to raise them all. Taking in the enormity of the situation, Clara slid into the chair across from his desk. For most folks, $8,000 was more money than they would ever see in their lifetime, more than a struggling ranch could produce in 2 months. No doubt, something must exist. Finally, she said, "We can do it." Typically, banks don't abruptly demand full payment. Eli gave a sour laugh. "They have shown more patience than was necessary. Since the decline in cow prices last spring, I have fallen behind on my payments. I continued to believe that I could catch up, but this drought made matters worse." Clara looked at his face, seeing the worry mixed with frustration and shame. "Why didn't you inform me of the problems facing the ranch, since you weren't supposed to handle it? You're here to work, not to correct my errors." But Clara said, "It explains so much. A puzzle's pieces coming together. Why have you been employing inexperienced workers? What's the reason for your heavy workload? Why do you live like a man who's reluctant to spend money on comfort?" Reluctantly, Eli nodded. "I've been making every effort to reduce my expenses. I couldn't afford the danger of hiring you, but I couldn't handle both the house and the ranch work." Clara experienced a complex range of emotions, including pity for Eli's predicament, rage that he had concealed something so significant, and an increasing sense of resolve that they would somehow find a solution. "What choices do you have? Finding a buyer for the land would take months, and there's no assurance I'd receive enough money to cover the debt. To recoup what they can, the bank will probably foreclose and sell the property at auction. What happens to you after that?" Eli gave a forced, casual shrug. "I'll find a solution. Consider taking a job on someone else's ranch." However, the majority of operations in this area are also having difficulties. Gazed out at the place she had grown to love, the mountains that gave everything a magnificent backdrop, the undulating pastures where cattle grazed contentedly, and the meticulous upgrades that revealed generations of pride and hard work. She recalled what he had said earlier, "This land has been in your family for 3 generations, and the one who loses it will be me." Eli's voice was raw with immediate pain. Clara looked back at him as a thought started to take shape. What if there were an alternative? "I've gone over the statistics 100 times. Clara, that amount of money cannot be raised in 60 days. What if we had a partner who was prepared to contribute money to the ranch in return for a share of the property?" Eli shook his head. "If I don't have the time to locate investors and close deals, who would invest in a failing business?" Knowing that she was going to alter everything between them, Clara inhaled deeply. "Yes, I would." Though Eli's face stayed the same, the ensuing silence was filled with shock and possibly hope. Cautiously protected. "You have no idea what you're proposing, Clara. I completely get it. I've saved up enough cash to make a big difference, but not enough to completely cure the issue. Additionally, my abilities might contribute to the ranch's resurgence in profitability." "What is the amount of money at issue?" Knowing how her meager savings would seem in comparison to the ranch's massive debt, Clara had been dreading this. Question. $1,200 or so. Although it isn't much, $1,200 would pay the overdue balances and buy us some time. Eli leaned forward in his chair and interrupted. However, Clara, it would be quite dangerous to invest in this ranch. You might lose everything, Clara said. I've already lost everything once. The distinction is that this time, I would be taking the risk myself, rather than having it decided for me. Eli took a close look at her face. Why would you do this? You have security, regular pay, and a nice job. Why put your money at risk for a ranch? That might not succeed anyhow. Clara knew how to describe emotions that she was still processing. Because this location is important. Because what we do here is important. Because, she said, pausing to muster the guts to be absolutely honest. Because losing this ranch would kill something important in you, and you matter. More personal than anything either had ever expressed before, the words hovered between them. Eli swallowed forcefully, and Clara saw his throat work. We would still need to find ways to increase income even with your investment, he said. At last. The cattle business isn't making enough money on its own. Next, we broaden our scope. The demand from other ranchers is increasing, and you have land for producing hay. We could grow the garden and sell the town's hotel vegetables. We haven't yet investigated all of the alternatives. Clara looked him in the eyes. I want to be more than just a cleaner who happens to own a portion of the ranch. If I'm spending my savings, I want to be a true partner in the choices that will impact its destiny. Eli remained silent for a while, and Clara questioned whether she would push too quickly or too forcefully. His voice was raspy with emotion. When he did speak, I have no idea how to be someone's companion. I've spent so much time by myself, making all of the decisions. Part of what makes partnerships work is learning to share responsibility, Clara remarked gently. Thomas also had to teach me that. Additionally, we will lose your money in addition to everything else, if the ranch fails. Nevertheless, on her life since arriving at Thornridge, the fulfillment of fulfilling work. Her developing friendship with Eli, and the feeling of she had found her purpose again. At least then, we'll have made an effort together. Though it doesn't ensure success, that's worth something. I understand that if we do this, it changes everything between us. If we do this, he said slowly, it changes everything between us. We'd be equal partners, sharing both the risks and the rewards. Eli stood and walked to the window, studying the land that represented for generations of his family's dreams and struggles. When he turned back to Clara, she saw resignation mixed with something that might have been relief. Eli held out his hand across the desk. Partners. Clara's hand firmly, feeling the calluses that matched her own and the strength that she had come to rely on. As they started formulating their plan to save Thornridge Ranch, Clara realized she had just made the biggest leap of faith. Something profitable. You'd own half of whatever we create together. Clara nodded. Lose your family's land. We both understand the stakes. Clara's savings book lay opened on the kitchen table between them. Its careful columns of figures representing 2 years of scrimping and sacrifice. The small leather-bound ledger contained $1,237. Every penny she'd managed to save since Thomas's death, plus the wages she'd earned at Thornridge. Are you certain about this? She was risking not just her financial security, but her heart on a partnership that could either fulfill her deepest hopes or destroy what little stability she'd managed to rebuild when she saw Eli's face. Eli, whose coffee was getting cold as he gazed at the numbers that morning, asked for the third time, represented all of Clara's financial security. I've never been more certain of anything, Clara said, her heart thumping against her ribs as she spoke. But the alternative of watching Eli lose his family's ranch while she stood safely on the sidelines was unthinkable. They had spent 3 days formulating their plan, and Clara's savings would cover the missed mortgage payments and provide operating capital for their expanded plans, while Eli would contribute his knowledge and the remaining cattle as they collaborated to diversify the ranch's revenue streams before the last payment was due. The key is presenting ourselves as established partners, Eli said, going over their plan once more. Because buyers respect operations that look stable and well managed. Eli had contacts in Denver's cattle auction from his father's before winter feeding costs became prohibitive. Clara nodded, realizing the psychology at play. They needed every advantage they could get, and confidence bred confidence. How many heads are we taking? 43. Of our best breeding stock. It's risky. We're selling animals that might give birth to calves next spring, but we need the immediate cash more than the long-term potential. The preparation work was intense and draining. Clara threw herself into the tasks with determined energy, helping to sort cattle, arrange transportation, and plan their approach to potential buyers. Jake had proven invaluable, using his connections to arrange favorable trucking rates and advising them on which animals would bring the best prices. You two make a good team, Jake noted the night before their departure, watching Clara and Eli work together seamlessly to finish their preparations. It was the first time since he returned from the war that I've seen Eli this focused on something constructive. The chess set had been moved aside to make room for papers and calculations. But Clara noticed Eli's fingers drumming against the table in the same pattern he used when considering a difficult chess move. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the comment, but also a warm satisfaction. Their partnership had developed a natural rhythm that surprised them both, where Eli's military experience provided strategic thinking and attention to detail. Clara's intuition and people skills filled gaps he didn't even realize existed. The night before the auction, they sat at the kitchen table one last time, reviewing their backup plans and contingency strategies. Gently, she inquired. Frightened. Eli said, I've never had this much riding on a single day, and I've never had a partner whose financial future depended on my decisions, although the gesture was meant to be consoling. Clara felt something electric pass between them the moment their skin touched, indicating that their partnership had evolved beyond a business arrangement into something neither of them had anticipated. Eli didn't pull away, instead turning his hand palm up and briefly squeezing her fingers. Thank you, he added softly, for having faith in this place when I myself had nearly given up. I appreciate you allowing me to help save it. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, hands still touching, both aware that tomorrow would determine not just the ranch's future, but the shape of whatever was developing between them. If they succeeded, they would truly be partners in every sense. If they failed, Clara would lose her savings and Eli would lose his heritage. But they would face those consequences together. We should probably get some sleep, Eli said finally, moved to break the contact between them. Probably, Clara agreed, equally reluctant to end the moment. Clara experienced a bodily loss when they eventually parted ways, since she could no longer feel his touch. With a mix of excitement and fear, she realized she was falling for Eli Thatcher, between chess games and storm repairs, between coffee in the morning and discussions in the evening. Her sentiments had evolved from friendship and respect into something much more valuable and hazardous. The morning of their departure was cold and clear, with the mountains piercing a clear sky and frost glistening on the grass. Clara thought appearance would be important when they saw possible purchasers, so she dressed meticulously in her finest travel attire. Eli showed up in the kitchen with his boots shining and his hair meticulously brushed, dressed in a crisp shirt and his only suit jacket. Clara was proud of their collaboration, as he appeared to be the prosperous rancher he was determined to become once more. Clara heard layers of meaning in the straightforward question, ready? She picked up the little vise that held her savings book and their paperwork and said it was ready, with stops to check on the cattle and make sure they arrived in condition. The trip to Denver took the majority of the day. Gather information that could aid in their sales strategy. Clara spent the time observing other ranchers and their operations. Appear assured but not desperate. Eli served as a coach. On their way to the auction yards, show them that we are prosperous individuals, making business choices rather than farmers compelled to sell due to financial constraints. With hundreds of cattle, dozens of purchasers, and an atmosphere that suggested significant money exchanged hands, the auction house was bigger and more tumultuous than Clara had anticipated. In an attempt to convey the cool confidence of a seasoned partner, she remained near Eli when they registered their animals and were assigned lot numbers. A voice called over the crowded registration area. Thatcher, the man coming toward them, was well-dressed, self-assured, and had the demeanor of someone used to making big purchases. Eli Thatcher, as I live and breathe. The recognition lightened Eli's face. Eli held out his hand and said, Frank Morrison, it's to see you again. The same is true. I haven't seen you since the funeral for your father. Again, my sympathy for your loss. He was a fair dealer and a good man. You must be Mrs. Thatcher, Morrison said, turning his courteous inquiry to Clara. Eli entered the scene with ease before Clara corrected her presumption that her cheeks were warm. This is my partner, Clara May Hutchinson, he said, uttered with perfect poise. Morrison's eyebrows shot up as he said, She's been instrumental in improving our operation. Although somewhat female business partners were uncommon in the ranching industry, he maintained a polite expression. Meeting you, Mrs. Hutchinson, is a pleasure. Eli's partner is someone worth getting to know. Clara understood that Eli's quick thinking had given her they were presenting themselves as equal partners, exactly as they'd planned. As they made their way to the holding pens, she muttered, "Nice work." Eli said softly, "We're in this together. Making sure you receive the respect you are due is part of it." They would have time to network with possible purchasers and evaluate the competition before the actual auction started the next morning. Clara observed that other ranchers treated Eli with respect and acknowledgement when they passed through the facility, which was a positive reflection on his family's standing. "Your father frequently conducted business here?" In a calm moment, she inquired. For 20 years, Clara realized that they were not just selling cattle. They were re-establishing relationships that would benefit them for years to come. The idea both excited and alarmed her. Success tomorrow would mean more than rescuing the ranch. It would mean becoming true partners in a life and business that could thrive with careful care. That night, in their small hotel room with separate beds, Clara lay awake, listening to Eli's quiet breathing and reflecting on how much her life had changed. 6 months prior, she had been a desperate widow with no prospects. Eli pulled a worn silver dollar from his vest pocket the morning of the auction, its surface smoothed by decades of handling, and held it out to Clara as they stood outside the auction house, the coin catching the early sunlight. "My lucky piece," he said with a slight smile. "I carried it through the war and every important decision since." She would stand next to the man she loved and risk everything on their shared vision for the future tomorrow, and she knew she would never regret the decision to fight for something worth saving. "Today is the day I want you to have it." Clara took the silver dollar, being aware of the gesture's meaning. This wasn't just good fortune. It was a physical embodiment of their common destiny and a sign of trust. "Are you certain? We are now partners. Your luck is my luck." Already, the auction house was a hive of activity. Sellers making last-minute arrangements, and buyers inspecting livestock. Eli and Clara early to give their livestock a final examination and make sure they were in top condition for possible buyers. Their plan was well thought out. Clara would concentrate on establishing a rapport with customers and projecting a stable and well-run enterprise, while Eli would handle the technical conversations regarding bloodlines and breeding history. The night before, they would rehearse their strategy, practicing answers to common queries and worries. "Recall that we are prosperous ranchers, making strategic choices, not desperate individuals compelled to sell," Eli stated softly as they made their way to the registration counter. Clara nodded, shifting her stance to convey a sense of confidence that she didn't really possess. The silver dollar felt warm in her hand. Eli's confidence in their collaboration was put to the test right away. The auction manager, a busy man with inked fingers, glanced up from his ledger with barely disguised impatience. "Thatcher, right?" he asked, looking at his papers drearily. "You're scheduled for the afternoon session." "That's correct," Eli said evenly. "First time selling here," an accolade forward with ease. But the manager's tone indicated that this might be a problem. "Mr. Thatcher has been working on improving our breeding program instead of selling stock. We're only bringing our best animals to market." The manager's attitude changed a little as he noted Clara's presence and professional manner. "And you are Mr. Thatcher's business partner, Clarenson. We've been creating some creative approaches to sustainable ranching that have yielded outstanding results." Claron, her weeks of listening to Eli's plans and her own observations of successful farming practices, rotational grazing to improve pasture health, selective breeding for hardiness, rather than just size, and diversified income streams to reduce market vulnerability. Sounds promising. "Well, good luck today." The manager's expression became more interested as Eli shot her a grateful look. "Innovation is always welcome in this business." "What kind of approaches?" Eli shook his head admiringly as they left the registration desk. "Where did that come from?" "I've been paying attention," Clara said. Their first real test came an hour later, when they came across a group of established ranchers inspecting cattle in the holding pens. Clara recognized the kind of immediate success in used to dealing with other successful men, who might dismiss a female partner as window dressing rather than a real participant in the business. Thatcher called a tall man with silver hair and expensive boots. "Henry Caldwell from up in Montana. I heard you might have some breeding stock." "Mr. Caldwell," Eli said, shaking hands. "This is my partner, Clara Hutchinson. who has played a key role in the development of our breeding program. Caldwell shook hands with Clara in a perfunctory manner. Why manner? His focus already returning to Eli. What bloodlines are you working with? Clarioque before Eli could respond. Our foundation stock traces back to the Caldwell paused, obviously taken aback by the technical accuracy of her response. Maternal selection is gaining attention in progressive operations. What kind of survival rates are you seeing? 97% over the past 3 seasons, Clara confidently responded. We attribute that to careful genetic selection, combined with improved nutrition and veterinary care. Henderson line through our matriarchal breeding program. We've been selecting for calving ease and maternal instinct rather than pure size, which has given us healthier calves and higher survival rates. The discussion went on for 20 minutes. By the end, Caldwell was asking both partners the same questions and taking notes on which lots he wanted to look at more closely, with Clara displaying a thorough understanding of their breeding program and management techniques. Impressive operation, he said at the end. I'll definitely be bidding on some of your stock this afternoon. As Caldwell moved on, other buyers began approaching their group. Drawn by the obvious interest from a respected rancher, Clara found herself fielding questions about everything from feed programs to financial management. Drawing on knowledge she'd gained through years of farm experience and weeks of intensive preparation. You're a natural at this. I'm terrified, Clara said quietly. But I refuse to let you down, Eli said during a little pause between buyer talks. You're not disappointing anyone. Every anticipation I had when we became partners is being exceeded. By you, in Clara's pocket, the silver dollar appeared to get warmer. Whether by ability, luck, or willpower, they were gaining momentum throughout the morning that would help them win the important afternoon bidding. Numbers rose and fell, in a peculiar sort of music as the afternoon auction got underway, accompanied by the rhythmic cadence of the auctioneer's voice. Claret, in the buyer's area next to Eli, the Thorn Ridge Ranch deed which symbolized everything they were fighting to protect, folded meticulously in her perception. An hour would pass before their first lot was up, but Clara watched the early bids with increasing trepidation. A number of lots of good cattle sold for disappointing prices, and prices appeared to be lower than Eli had initially anticipated. The ranchers seated behind them whispered, "Too many people need to sell, not enough buyers with ready cash. Markets are soft today." Clara felt Eli tense next to her, so she reached over and gave him a quick squeeze. Although the silver dollar was still warm in her other pocket, even Lucky Charms had their limits. Clara held her breath when Lot 47, their first group of 10 young breeding cows, was finally called. The auctioneer's opening bid was $20 less than what they had hoped for, and the bidding began slowly. "These are quality animals," Eli said quietly, as she watched Henry Caldwell inspect the cattle one last time before he went back to his seat. As Caldwell entered the competition, the bidding increased, pushing the price above the opening offers. But the momentum stalled when it hit their lowest acceptable level, $55. The auctioneer called. "Do I hear 60? Clara quickly calculated that $55 per head for 10 cows would net them $550, barely enough to cover transportation costs and fees. Then, the buyer who had greeted them the day before, Frank Morrison, raised his hand. 60-65, Caldwell immediately responded. The ensuing bidding war drove the price to $82 per head, well above their projections. Clara experienced her first genuine surge of hope when the gavel fell. Their second lot did even better, with competition from 3 serious buyers, pushing the price to $90 per head. By the time their third group entered the ring, word had spread about the quality of Thorn Ridge cattle, and the bidding was lively from the opening call. Lot 49 announced the auctioneer had had 15 head of prime breeding stock from the Thatcher operation, which represents some of the finest genetics available in the region. Clara noticed several buyers who hadn't previously shown interest. Now, leaning forward attentively, Eli said, "Good start," but she could see the relief in his eyes. Clara had to fight the urge to cheer when the final gavel fell at $97 per head. "We're ahead of projections," she whispered to Eli as they waited for their next lot. "Don't celebrate yet," he replied. Morning networking was paying off as ranchers who had spoken with them chose to bid. The competition was fierce, with prices steadily rising past their most optimistic projections. However, there was cautious optimism in his voice. Lot 51 was their largest risk and greatest opportunity because it contained their best breeding cows, which might serve as the cornerstone of someone's entire operation. "We still have the most important group coming up," Knowing that these specific cattle were the result of years of meticulous genetic selection, they discussed whether or not to sell them. During their planning discussions, Eli had indicated that they may make enough money to save the ranch if they were to receive good rates for these 8. However, we lose our best genetics for insufficient return if the bidding is weak. Clara could see heads turning all around the auction house as the 8 cows approached the arena. The auctioneer apparently saw the opportunity, and they were clearly excellent animals. This is the type of breeding stock that creates reputations. Ladies and gentlemen, each person's opening bid is $100. Clara knew they were seeing something unique when 3 hands instantly shot up. The bidding swiftly surged over their break-even point and into territory that could actually save the ranch, surpassing their optimistic estimates. Frank Morrison and Henry Caldwell became the main rivals, and a third Colorado bidder added pressure that caused prices to continue rising. The Colorado buyer pulled out at $140 per head. Morrison raised his hand again after he paused at $160. Caldwell called forcefully, $175. Morrison shook his head after taking another look at the cattle. Henry, you're too wealthy for my blood. You own them. As soon as the gavel dropped to $175 per person, cleared the math, with $1,400 for 8 cows and the money from previous transactions. They were getting close to the amount they needed to pay the bank. Bidding for their last lot, which included 12 heads of mixed ages, was consistent but unimpressive. Mental calculations revealed that they had surpassed their most optimistic estimates by almost $800 by the time the final gavel landed. Eli muttered, "We did it," as they collected their documents. Clara stroked the deed in her pocketbook and said, "We actually did it," feeling the consequences of their accomplishments. 6 months after the auction, Clara stood at the kitchen window watching Eli install the new ranch sign they had commissioned from the local craftsman. The wooden board painted in crisp white letters against a dark green background read Thatcher May Ranch in elegant script, with smaller text below announcing quality breeding cattle and agricultural products. The ranch would survive. Their partnership was vindicated, and tomorrow they could begin building the future they'd risked everything to secure. More than financial success, Clara felt the deep satisfaction of a goal achieved through genuine teamwork. Clara poured coffee into 2 mugs and went outside to where Eli was repositioning the sign for the 3rd time. "It's crooked," he declared, taking a step back to evaluate his work. "It's perfect," Clara said, handing him his coffee, "just like everything else around here." Eli accepted the coffee and studied the sign with satisfaction, thinking it sends the right message. That we're partners in every sense of the word. The morning brought with it the sweet smell of fresh grass and the sound of cattle contentedly lounging in pastures that had recovered from the previous year's drought. Word, yes, I believe it does. Their operation had changed more than they had anticipated in the previous months. The proceeds from the cattle auction had paid the bank and given working capital for improvements that were already yielding dividends. Their diversification into hay production had produced a steady secondary source of income. And Clara's expanded garden provided vegetables to the town's hotel and nearby ranches. More importantly, though, their partnership had become something neither had dared hope for when they had first shaken hands over a desperate business arrangement. Ranch had slowly transformed into a cozy closeness based on respect, hard effort, and developing love. "Jake will be here soon," Eli added, looking at his pocket watch. "And we should review the breeding schedule for the new stock to carry out the genetic enhancement program Clara had described to bidders. They would buy young calves from Henry Caldwell's Montana business, with a portion of the money raised at the auction. Better pasture management and healthier calves were already demonstrating the return on investment, starting a positive growth cycle. Clara was astonished at how different everything seemed within the house compared to the first time she had entered these rooms. The basic arrangement and furnishings were the same, but warmth and areas that had before only been functional were now alive again. Every room was adorned with flowers from her rehabilitated gardens, and the kitchen was no longer merely a space for cooking, but rather the center of a house. "I never thanked you properly," Eli stated abruptly, as he paused his breeding record scrutiny. "You rescued me too," Clara said, setting down her coffee and looking at him. "For what?" "For seeing possibilities when I could only see problems. For believing in this place when I had almost given up on it," Clara said, suddenly nervous. "There's something we should probably discuss." Eli's expression grew concerned. "You know, when I answered that advertisement, I was looking for work, but I found purpose instead. We found each other, Eli said quietly. The simple statement carried weight that went far beyond their business partnership. Over the months of working together, sharing meals, planning for the future, and building something meaningful with their combined efforts, they discovered a connection that neither had expected to find again. Eli was silent for a moment, and Clara was afraid she had misunderstood the situation completely. But then he reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb making gentle circles. Difficulties. Well, people in town are starting to ask questions about our arrangement. Mrs. Henderson mentioned for supplies yesterday. What kind of questions? Clara asked herself, feeling heat rise in her cheeks, wondering whether two people who clearly care about each other and live on the same property might want to make their partnership official in more ways than one. On her hand, what did you say to Mrs. Henderson? That it was nobody's business but ours. Good response. Eli's voice was loving, but I must admit that the thought has crossed my mind more than once. Clara's heart skipped. What was it? The notion that the best partnerships occasionally develop into something even better. The notion that two individuals who get along well might also make a marriage. Is that a proposal? Eli Thatcher. It's a discussion about possibilities, Eli said with a faint smile. However, if you want to hear a real proposal, I could probably handle one. Clara laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. I might be interested in hearing that. Eli stood and walked around the table, taking both of her hands in his. Clara May Hutchinson, you've given this ranch new life and restored hope to my heart. Would you consider making our partnership permanent in every way that matters? When they finally parted, Clara could see their future stretching ahead of seasons of hard work and quiet contentment. Challenges met with combined strength, and the deep satisfaction of a life chosen rather than simply endured. Outside the kitchen window, the new ranch sign caught the morning sunlight. Its fresh paint, bright against the backdrop of rolling pastures and distant mountains. Eli's kiss was gentle and sure, carrying the promise of shared tomorrows and the satisfaction of dreams they'd built together. Arrangement? No, it was a combination of hope, legacy, and home that would last far longer than either of them. Clara had arrived at Thornridge with the intention of forework and instead discovered paradise. Fairy tale paradise is not the same as the real-world paradise of purposeful work, sincere collaboration, and blossoming love from the same goal, and mutual respect. At times, she stood in contemplation, gazing out at the property they would work together from Eli's arms. Life's greatest things were disguised as last resorts.